Welcome to Infinite Models. If you like building aircraft, any type of armor, how about prehistoric or current wildlife? Autos of all shapes and sizes and genres, seafaring subjects of all types, and figures, vignettes, and dioramas, then this group was made for you.
I get to come in here and I love sharing with you guys these stories. So let me see if we're going to talk about the F-86s and what they faced as a fighter aircraft during that war. The numbers are just unbelievable. And I've got about 4 little kind of short stories, vignettes, if you will, within this longer story of the Korean Air War that I want to share with you. So, June 1950, the Inman gun races across the 38th parallel. I talked about this last week. Shoved them all the way down in the southeast to this little bit of this peninsula where there's a harbor at Pusan. Darn near shoved them into the sea. Fortunately, 15 September, MacArthur makes this amazing surprise amphibious landing at Incheon, cuts off their supply lines. Most of the roads that run along the Han River and through Seoul, they cut all that off. North Koreans recognize they're cut off, so they start a hasty retreat. And by November, we've shoved them all the way back up to the northwest, and they're getting crowded along the Yalu River, China up here, Russia up over here. And in December, the Chinese release, 6 army divisions or whatever it was, 3 army groups. I can't remember the titling, but it's basically 1 million men come across and push everything clear back south again until they stabilized right about the 38th parallel just after or towards the end of December 1950 into early January 1951. So June 1950, the war starts. They get shoved down to Pusan, pushing them, kicking their butts all the way back north by November. People are professing home by Christmas. Well, during November, the fighting's going on, and a number of MiGs started to make their way out of their Manchurian sanctuary up here, and they're making forays into the north. And the only things that we had in theater at that time to counter them, we had F-51 Mustangs, we had F-7F Tiger Cats, and F-4U Corsairs that the Navy and Marine Corps flew. But on the Air Force side, there was the F-51 Mustangs and the F-82 Twin Mustangs. And then we had straight wing jets like the Lockheed P-80, F-80 Shooting Star, and you had the Grumman F-9, F-2, the Panther, not the swept wing Cougar, the Dash 8, but the straight wing Dash 2 Panther. And so that's what we had to counter these MiG-15s with. And none of those aircraft were in the MiG speed class at all. And they were way outclassed. And it was a real cause for concern. They were our stopgap measure. And so what the Pentagon did was in November 1950, they started flooding the zone, and they sent the 4th Fighter Group, which had 3 squadrons of F-86A aircraft. They were in Japan. They moved them over to Korea, and they took up in bases at the north end of the South. And because of the push, we actually took over some of their bases in North Korea, the south end of North Korea. Well, in December, when the Chinese entered and started pushing everything back down the peninsula, and actually all the way, they pushed back so hard that we wound up having to move the F-86s back over to Japan. And from Japan, flying way out here in the east, coming across the Sea of Japan into the north and all the way up to this MiG alley, the F-86 Sabres, even with fuel tanks, just its legs were too short. It didn't have the ability to get up here, loiter, engage, fight. And so from the period of 22 December of 1950 all the way through 31 March 1951, there wasn't a single MiG-15 kill registered by F-86s. They just didn't have the legs to get to them. And there was two reasons for that. One is they didn't have the legs to get to them, and that the MiGs, when they came across, basically stayed out of reach, and they chose not to engage. I think they were kind of, you feel like a boxer when they just kind of jab for a while, feeling each other out. I think that's kind of what was going on. And no MiG kills, 22 December to 31 March 1951. But shortly after that, things started to change a little bit, and activity starts picking up in April, May, June, all the way through August. And so they're having some engagements. Now, during the month of May 1951, there was a total of only 5 MiG-15s killed in the month of May. But on 20 May 1951, Captain James Jabara, a name you might recognize, Captain Jabara, he was the first jet ace, and he downed his 5th and 6th kills on 20 May 1951. And I point that out. It's significant for two reasons. One is he's America's first jet ace, and second, when you only have 5 kills in the entire month, he had 2 of them. That guy had 40% of the MiG kills for the entire month. So things are going along. We're having some engagements. There's some knotting up, locking horns taking place between F-86s, MiG-15s. But come September 1951, the activity didn't just ramp up. It went clean off the charts. And the Far East Air Force, FEEF, their analysts and their intelligence folks, they came to the conclusion that a lot of those North Korean pilots, because you had Chinese pilots, and Russia touches North Korea way up over here in the Northeast, and it was Russian pilots and Chinese pilots, even though we really didn't confirm that till years later, but they were training North Korean pilots in Manchuria. And in September, that first massive class of North Korean pilots, supplemented by some Russian and Chinese pilots, graduated. And the only way to get them the experience they need with what they've just been taught was to throw them into the deep end of the pool. And in September, the engagements with MiG-15s went clean off the chart. So we've got the 4th Fighter Group is here at Kimpo Air Base, K-14. And they are the only aircraft that really go up here, because the Panthers and the Shooting Stars really are not enabled to take on MiG-15s. So the F-86As are going up here. And you got to realize that one fighter group, 3 squadrons, 24 airplanes per squadron at full strength. So if they were full strength. So if all 3 squadrons are at full strength, we've got a total of 74 F-86A Sabres in country fighting, as it turns out, over 800 MiG-15s. That was the ratio in those, through the whole war, basically. But there was, FEEF came up with, spread across all these Manchurian bases up here, over 800 MiG-15 fighters that ventured south at one point or another. And so in September, when that training is complete and all those MiGs are available, they just literally got thrown right into the chasm, and the fighting kicked off. 16 October 1951, biggest jet battle in history took place. Okay, biggest jet battle in history up to that point. I'll admit that. But it was the biggest one in history. Over 100 MiG-15s came south out of China across the Yalu River. The fights were going from 30,000 feet all the way down to treetop level. You had all 3 squadrons, 72 planes roughly at max engaged, and you had some were a high cap, and they came in at like 38,000 feet. You had some that were mid caps at about 20,000 feet, and then you had the low caps were flying between 10 and 12,000 feet. And so F-86 pilots were reporting MiGs everywhere from 30,000 feet all the way down to treetop level. And it was just a furball of stuff. And at the end of the day, on that day, there were 8 MiG-15 kills on that date, 16 October 1951. It was the highest kill tally of MiGs to that date. They'd had a couple of days where there was 6, but most of them were 1 or 2. This one, 8 MiG kills on one day, but over 100 of them bounced the Americans. Major Franklin Fisher, he was telling a story about, he was with his flight just south of Sinuiju, and they're in MiG Alley coming in from the sea, south of Sinuiju, 20,000 feet, and they got bounced by, a bunch of MiG-15s. And he, what he did was, when all this melee started, he rolls up in his F-86 and kind of wings over. Now, the F-86, bigger, heavier, and even faster, but especially in a dive, than the MiG-15. MiG-15, smaller, lighter, little more nimble. Differences in firepower. The F-86 had 6 50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each cheek. The MiG-15 flew 2 23 millimeter and 1 30 millimeter cannon in the nose. Much heavier hitting power, but the cyclic rate of fire was much slower than the 50 cals. And so the Americans could put a great deal of lead downrange that didn't have as heavy an impact, but because it was so fast in impact, they really did quite damage. So this guy, knowing what he's got, knowing what they've got, he rolls up, and so he gets pounced, rolls and breaks the engagement, and as he comes out of the roll, there's a MiG-15 right in front of him, right? There's over 100 of them in the sky, so he just makes a break roll, comes out, and boom, there's a MiG right in front of him. So he lines up, he squeezes the trigger, and he's hitting this MiG-15. 50 cals throwing all, 6 of them, just and pieces are flying off the airplane. He's flying through the debris, and this guy starts porpoising the airplane, trying to break the contact with the Sabre and get away. And finally, he goes into a climb, and he just, Major Fisher just pulls back on the stick, and he's lined up, and he starts pouring more and more lead in there. Next thing he knows, the canopy comes back, the pilot jumps out of that MiG-15. He was like, okay, I'm done. Strike 1, kill. So as that happens, he gets a call that there's a bogey on his tail. So he slams the throttle forward and again rolls and starts to head for the deck. And he goes down. He was able to, in a diving roll, he breaks away from that MiG. And when he rolls out of that, there's another MiG right in front of him going the same direction. So he's coming out of the dive. He's got much more energy. He's closing on him fast. He pulls up, he starts squeezing the trigger, and his rounds are hitting. If you were to have a little X over the canopy, please shoot here, that's where his fire is hitting. Just tearing up the canopy. This MiG pulls up and tries to climb away from the F-86, not realizing that he just came out of a dive and he still has all of that energy. The F-86 pulls up with him, just simple as you care. And he continues squeezing and just hammering away at that cockpit area until that MiG just stops into a stall, augers over, goes straight into the ground below, no shoot. He probably hammered that pilot. So Major Fisher became one of the first, double kills in a day, right up there with Captain James Jabara. He did that on 16 October 51, the largest air-to-air battle to take place in history, but up to that point. So during that period, March, April, May, and from not much going on, like I said, December to March, no MiG kills whatsoever. April, things start to pick up a little bit. You measure the 4-month period from May through August of 1951, there was a total of 32 MiG kills in those 4 months. So they're killing about, 8 MiGs a month, something like that. So 4 months, 8 MiGs a month, 32 kills. Well, September, that training class graduates, they're thrown into the chasm, and from September to December of 1951, there was 111 MiG-15 kills. So you went from 32 in this 4-month period to 111 in this 4-month period. The activity in MiG Alley just went crazy. And so this is when FIF finally discovered, through all of their surveillance and we had a lot of photo reconnaissance aircraft. They could fly along the Yalu. We weren't supposed to go into China, but they were taking pictures all along there. And FIF came up with 800 MiGs scattered north of the Yalu River, all up there in their Manchurian sanctuary, and one fighter group. So this is, now it's September, October, November of 1951. And the Pentagon again goes, okay, we need to get this rectified. And so what they did was they stood down the 51st Fighter Group, and the 51st had F-80 Shooting Stars, and they even had a squadron of, I think, like F-82s. They stand down the whole 51st, and we shipped all new slat-wing F-86Es from the States into country. They took another very famous name, Colonel Francis Gabreski. He was made the commander of the 51st Fighter Group. And so they stand up with 3 more fresh squadrons of F-86 drivers, brand new F-86E slat-wing, very maneuverable F-86s. And now, with 2 groups, you had the 4th group was again at K-14 in Kimpo, and the 51st Fighter Group was at K-13 in Suwon. And now we've got 2 bases worth of F-86s who are taking it to the North Koreans. The odds, however, were still 7-1 in favor of the North Koreans and the number of MiGs they had. So as you start to really look at how things were shaping up in Korea, any fighter pilot will tell you that speed and altitude are your greatest allies when it comes to fighting fighter to fighter. Speed and altitude. The F-86 and their engines was a faster aircraft than the MiG-15. It was a lot heavier, so it was really faster in a dive. The MiG-15, on the other hand, was very light, very nimble. It was faster in a climb, and you didn't want to get into the furball with the MiG-15. I already alluded to the armament, and so we've got people, tacticians and analysts, they're taking all of these after-action reports from the combat, from the fighting, they're bringing all this to heart. And so what you see is the U.S. had very high cyclic rate of fire 50 cal machine guns with not a lot of hitting power, where the Russians, the North Koreans, had real high hitting power but a very low cyclic rate of fire. And that's what actually pushed us to develop 2 things. One was the M61 Vulcan that came along later that was installed in aircraft. And the second was the 20 millimeter automatic cannon, because when you went up to the 20 millimeter shell, now you had hitting power, and in the automatic cannon, you also had high cyclic rate of fire. So you were putting a lot of stuff downrange, causing damage. Well, the whole speed and altitude piece, the F-86 was faster, but it was a lot heavier. And the F-86 was heavier because we built a lot of safety, redundant, and emergency systems into the F-86 that were not built into the MiG. And by that I mean the F-86 had emergency fuel pumps that would operate on batteries. They had emergency igniter systems in case of a flameout. You had self-sealing fuel tanks, a lot of armor plating and armor reinforcement to protect the pilot in vital areas of the aircraft. The MiG-15, on the other hand, didn't have all that armor, didn't have self-sealing tanks, didn't have a lot of these things, and it by comparison was kind of like the Japanese Zero in World War II. Very nimble, very light, lots of hitting power between the 7.62 guns in the wings and the bigger guns in the cowlings. But again, no armor, no self-sealing tanks, and when things like the Corsairs and the Hellcats came along with the absolute punching power of their 50 cal Browning machine guns, they were just tearing the Mitsubishi aircraft up because of how light and delicate they were, frankly. So these are the 2 you have that are as combatants, but because that MiG-15, and it had a Russian knockoff of the British Rolls-Royce Nene engine was what powered it. Well, the MiG-15 could get all the way to 50,000 feet and maybe a little bit more. It flew at 50,000 feet. The F-86, they typically operated up to 38,000, but they could go to 45,000. But if you hear those numbers, the MiG-15 had a 5 to 12,000 foot ceiling advantage on the F-86s. And that's what I alluded to earlier when I said sometimes the MiGs just didn't come down to fight. They'd climb their ladder all the way to 50,000 feet, and then they would dictate the terms of combat that day. Do we come down and fight you, or do we just kind of see what you're doing and go home? And the MiGs had that luxury. So the altitude was a real problem. And it came into play one day. Lieutenant Colonel Kelly of the 25th Fighter Squadron related a story in mid-November 1951. This is in the middle of all the melee. He was leading the 25th Fighter Squadron. They came north from Suwon, flew along the western edge towards Sinuiju, and they were turning inboard to the east before they get across the Yalu River. They're on patrol, 38,000 feet, and literally like saw nothing this day. They're looking around, they're checking for MiGs, they're looking high, looking low, looking left, looking right, and it was just a calm day flying in the sky. One of his pilots calls out and says, bingo, which when you hear a bingo call, the guy's getting low on fuel, it's time to get home. He's got enough to get back, and that's about it. And so Colonel Kelly calls over the radio, and he turns everybody inboard to start heading south and go ahead and get home. They turn south and southwest to get out over the ocean, head south and break back in. They want to not spend as much time over Indian country as possible. And so at 38,000 feet, they begin their turns. And right as they're halfway through their turn, they knew they were being bounced. And the way they knew they were being bounced was probably the weirdest thing Colonel Kelly had ever seen. That day, the sky started raining drop tanks. As the MiGs came down from 50,000 or maybe even better, they come down from 50,000 feet, and as they were approaching the formation of F-86s, now turning, they ejected their underwing fuel tanks to lighten up the wings, get the loading back so they can do air-to-air combat. And Colonel Kelly and his boys knew they were being bounced only because looking out their cockpit, external fuel tanks are flying through their formation. Next thing you know, 23 millimeter, 30 millimeter cannons are raining down. These guys went from bingo to over the radio, called, break right, break left, they're moving. And these guys start moving and slopping and shooting and jerking the stick around, pouring the coals on the throttle. And Colonel Kelly looks around, his wingman, gone. He figures he probably rolled off after a quarry somewhere. The guy didn't get one that day, but he's cranking his neck around in ways God never designed the neck to move, trying to figure out where he's at, if anything's on his tail. And he looks over, and just out the right side of his cockpit, just below him, is a MiG-15 in a climb, lined up on him. And this guy is like a second away from squeezing the trigger. He's like, I am in his sights. And he rolls his F-86 and begins a split S dive right for the deck. F-86 is faster, especially in a dive. This guy's in a climb toward me. He figures his best defensive maneuver was a split S to the deck. So he rolls on his back, pulls full back on the stick, tips over, and he heads down and literally pulls out 10 feet off the Yalu River. And he is honking along now, built up all kinds of speed. He starts craning his neck around, looking back over his shoulder again, and lo and behold, he did not lose that MiG. That dude like literally attached a tow cable to the ass end of his plane, and he went down with him and leveled out. And this guy, again, the twinkling starts on the front of his airplane as he's lighting up the sky with 23 millimeter and 30 millimeter shells. So he starts honking his plane around. He is banking left, banking right, running down the Yalu River, trying to get to safety and freedom. And he finally gets near the mouth, and he throws up in a big high left-hand bank and pulls back on that stick. And he starts doing laps inside himself. And this MiG is right in there with him. And there's an island just off the mouth of the river delta. And he comes out of one turn and flattens out a little bit, and he gets over it and then throws it back up and starts honking around that island again. And over his head, he's looking, he can hear that MiG bearing down on him. And he's thinking, am I going to get out of here today? But he is pulling and honking in there. G's pulling. His G suit, he said, was about to pop. And all of a sudden, over his radio, he hears, hey, Checkertail. He stalled out and hit the water. And he rolls and pulls up and looks back over his shoulder. And sure enough, that MiG-15, trying to stay with him in that turn, bled all of his energy, stalled and hit the river. But because the other guy saw it. He was credited with the kill that he did flying around the island off the end of the Yalu River. Stalled and went in the river. He said there was some drinks flowing at the officers club that night. So those are a couple of the, I'm telling you about Major Fisher and his 2 kills on 16 October. I told you about Major Jabara, his 2 kill night, become the first jet ace. And then this flight with Colonel Kelly and running a MiG into the ground in a tight turn. And that was one of those days when it was like 100 MiGs on, 50 US, 100 MiGs on 50 Sabres, and always outnumbered. And those are the flights where a lot of the stuff that was happening goes right. There was a number of times where things didn't always go so right. And in late November 1951, Lieutenant Sam Reeder, he is with a flight. A flight is 4 aircraft, 2 sections, right? So there's the flight lead and Reeder, he's his wingman. And then there's the section lead and his wingman, 4 in the flight. They're at 45,000 feet, and they are heading up to Mig Alley to begin their patrol for the day, 4 aircraft. Now, mind you, there were days when it was 32 F-86s versus 150 MiGs at one time. 32 F-86s, 150 MiGs. And that would happen multiple times, twice a day, 150 to 32. When they finally got the 51st stood up and moved in country with Colonel Gabreski, Fief estimated their disadvantage was now only 7-1, but they were still outnumbered 7-1. You got this flight of 4 aircraft heading into Indian country, and they are literally anticipating being jumped by no less than 28 MiGs, because 7-1 is basically the ratio. And so they're tooling along 45,000 feet. Lieutenant Reeder, his aircraft was sluggish this day. The throttle would not stay advanced. The engine was kind of just bogging. He said it was like flying through pudding. There was something going on, and he was having a hard time keeping up with his lead. When they get beyond a certain area in the north, they go radio silent to not triangulate, and give their position away. So he had been telling his lead since they left Suwon, my bird's struggling, my crate's broken, I'm having problems keeping up. And they got up here and they were just about to enter Mig Alley, 45,000 feet, and Sam Reeder has flame out. Pilot light went out. He's like, not only am I in Indian country, I'm in Mig Alley, 45,000 feet. Now, if you understand that what happens when there's a flame out, number one, the electric fuel pumps are still on. The engine's not burning it. 45,000 feet, that cold altitude air now condensing off the aircraft. You have the fuel that's unburned flowing out of the airplane into that slipstream is a giant white finger in the sky. Anybody within 50 miles sees that banner that says, "Kill me, kill me." That's what he's flying with, 45,000 feet, when the pilot light goes out. He calls over to the lead. He tells, and the lead says, go home. They're basically like, get the hell out of here. You're no good to us now. No engine. Those safety systems I talked about earlier, yes, the F-86 had an emergency auto relight, right? For in the air, they had an emergency ignition, an emergency fuel pump. They had emergency reflight, in-flight restart procedures. There's a problem though, air density. The whole approach is air, fire, fuel. Well, you have to have air, and at 45,000 feet, the air is so thin that there's not enough in there, 1, to keep the vanes spinning, and 2, to burn. Not for an ignition like this. So the flight manual for the F-86 says you can only do it below 18,000 feet. This guy's at 45,000 feet, rolls his airplane up, starts heading back for the Yellow Sea, the China Sea. He's got himself in a glide slope at about 180 knots, and he's going down as fast as he can, because he knows he's leading this big white plume in the sky behind him of all the unburnt fuel. And as he's flowing down, he's getting ready to start going through the checklist to start lighting things up. Well, guess what? All those cockpit warming and glass warming and all that stuff was shut off. It's really cold up there. And now you've got the cockpit that has, he's been perspiring. We're going into combat. He's lost his engine. He's probably really perspiring now. All of the moisture in his canopy, it starts icing up. And I'm not just like icing up. I mean, like you can't see anything out of here. The whole canopy, hood, and windscreen. Fortunately, except for the armored glass directly in front of him, just this little portal into the world, that glass was so thick that it wasn't freezing. It was the only thing he had to see out into the world. So he is in a dive. He has no power, engines out, can't start the restart until, relight until under 18,000 feet. Canopy's frozen over. He doesn't know if he's being jumped by MiGs, hit by MiGs, stalked by MiGs. He's lost the ability to communicate with people because he's got no power. He's in a glide. He gets down to about 18,000 feet. Everything's iced up. And he starts going through the, emergency fuel pump on, emergency igniter switch on, emergency this on, and all the systems are go. And the last thing is literally like, reaching underneath your furnace and boom, hitting the pilot light. He reaches down and he starts throwing that air restart switch. It caught on the first turn, thank God. I forgot to tell you, before he came to it, he's in a dive. Fuel pumps are electric. They're still pushing fuel in an unburning engine. You can't ignite that lest you blow your whole back end off and you look almost like something comical. So as he's coming out of his dive, again, all iced over, he has to pull up and porpoise the aircraft and literally pour all of that stationary static fuel that's pooling in his engine well out the back end of the airplane without losing so much airspeed that he stalls. So he porpoises the plane, he's dumping fuel, he tips back over. Now he's got to build speed back up to get those vanes spinning to 15 to 18% RPM. And he finally gets back to about 18% RPM, and that's when he lights it off. So thank goodness his engine restarts, because now cabin heater and all the stuff comes right back on. His canopy starts to clear away, and he's looking around like MiG, 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 MiG. Starts doing some S turns to clear himself. He was clear and he went home. Well, that's not the end of the story with that airplane. That happened to him. The pilot light went out 45,000 feet, flying over Indian country. That plane was on 4 other missions scheduled during the coming week, and the engine flamed out 4 more times. With each time that it flamed out after it did with him, they didn't do a thing about it. Young captains, lieutenants flying the airplane. On the 4th flight, it happened to be a squadron commanding officer was at the stick when the airplane flamed out for the 4th time in a row. And the CO was able to do an air restart and get that airplane home. And guess what? That's when they finally pulled that F-86 out of service and sent it to Japan and got the stinking engine repaired. I mean, the circumstances they put some of these people into are just unreal. So Sam Reeder had that engine flame out, and that was his story, coming down and regaining, and at least that one had a happy ending. There's other times when things happen that the endings may not be quite as happy, and things don't go quite as right as they're supposed to. And Lieutenant Lee Brewer had one of those days. Lieutenant Lee Brewer was in a flight of aircraft early December 1951, and they're flying into North Korea, heading for their perch in Mig Alley. Basically they're playing the Warriors thing, right? Clanking their beer bottle. Warriors, come out and play. Looking for the MiGs. Well, this day was one of those 150 to 32 melees. They were bringing in, Lieutenant Brewer's flight was at about 30,000 feet, and they had other F-86s at 45,000 feet. There was some other F-86s at 12 or 18,000 feet, and it just started raining MiGs that day. 150 to 32 was the count on that day. And those guys got into the fur ball, and when all hell breaks loose like that, it comes so fast. If you're a wingman, you're lucky to stick with your lead. If you're a lead, you're lucky to have a wingman after about the first minute. But the amazing part is most of those great big fur balls like that and that kind of combat, it's over in 15 minutes. It's just sheer horror and the most physically exhausting thing you can do for 15 minutes when that happens. And so Lieutenant Lee Brewer, 30,000 feet, they are getting bounced by 150 MiGs, and they're rolling in at every altitude. They would plunge through the high cap all the way down into the mid cap, some of them even continuing down and just taking shots at each level, like going through plexiglass, right? I'll shoot at this, I'll shoot at this, I'll shoot at this. MiGs all over the sky. And these guys, again, the radios are full of brake right, brake left, you got one on your tail, pull up, bogey at your 6. And Brewer is deep in the kimchi. And he's fighting, and he goes bingo on fuel. He needs to start heading for home. So they're fighting just south east of Sinuiju, the major power plants there I told you about a couple of live events ago. And so they're south of Sinuiju, and they are in the melee in basically this whole southwestern part of North Korea. And he turns and starts heading for home. And he wants to get out off the coast before he starts, his break run to get down and turn in towards K-14 at Suwon. Well, he's making his break. He's heading away. He's kind of in a shallow descent, keeping his speed high. And as he's in this shallow descent, he's making he's doing these S turns so that he can clear himself. As he comes left, he can look over his left shoulder back into the rear. He can look down, brake to the right. He can look over his right shoulder back into the rear and down below. He can see you over top fairly well, but you do these S's to keep your arse and your belly clear. And he's making these S's, and out in the distance, he sees another F-86, but that crate was blowing smoke. He's kind of barely holding altitude, and it's smoke in a stream. And he tips his nose over a little further, and he's going to go and he's trying to call him and radio him, and nobody's answering. He's on guard, the emergency channels, and he's still continuing these clearing turns. And as he comes up in a left-hand turn at about his 4 o'clock position, here comes a MiG-15 that was at low speed and accelerating. And so seeing this MiG roll in, he pulls stick even harder and turns into him, and lo and behold, that MiG turns into him. The two of them wind up on a head-on, and they start scissor maneuvers where they're scissoring back and forth in and out of each other, trying to get the advantage of the upper hand. And on one of their last scissors before they had the approach, Lieutenant Reeder pulls the trigger, and he high deflection shot. But boom, he got the left wingtip, right side as he's facing it. He sees stuff fly off of the wingtip. He's got a hit, and he thinks that this MiG might roll over and go after the dying F-86. And he pulls up, and lo and behold, that MiG didn't roll and go after the stricken F-86. He pulled up with him, and they're almost going canopy to canopy, and they're turning into each other to try to get the advantage. No shots fired on the next intersection. They come out, and he pulls around. Well, that MiG, instead of coming around, rolled out and started to head for home. So Reeder's like, okay, that guy's clear, and that F-86 got out a little further away from him now, and he starts heading back towards it and advancing his throttles, and he's back to his S, clearing turns, trying to keep an eye on everything. And fortunately, no other MiGs were around, and as he's getting down closer, he finally recognizes a shape come away from that F-86, and a chute opens. So, and the F-86 just tipped over from there and went in. So he starts making radio calls. He's calling for, the Dumbo, the air-sea rescue. He's giving them location because he bailed out near over the water, and calling for air-sea rescue. Hopefully the U.S. Navy might be able to pick him up. But he's giving everybody coordinates, and so all these assets are being launched, and he turns and he heads for home. And months go by. We're into, the spring of 52, and had never heard anything, and then picked up and went on with the rest of his tour and rotated home. Several years later, then Lieutenant Brewer is now Major Brewer, and he's stationed at Nellis Air Force Base. And a number of, at the end of the Korean War, a lot of our POWs were not released right away. There was some negotiation for them, and some of them were held for several years and didn't get released until years later. And so he's at the Officers Club in Nellis Air Force Base, and a flight had arrived that day of some of the last POWs to be released from the Korean War, which had ended, a couple of years before. And so that flight lands, and the guys were brought in, and they were all kind of health screenings and all that, and cleared. And he's in the club that night, and in walks one of the guys who got off that flight. He was a POW since 1951, November of 1951, from the Korean War. And as Major Brewer is talking to him, he comes to realize that he's talking to the guy who was in the stricken F-86 that he cleared the MiG from, coming out of that MiG cap that day. And he starts talking with this guy, and the guy says, "Let me tell you about that day from my side," because he had no idea the MiG was there. He didn't even know the other F-86 was there. He was in that melee, 150 MiG-15s against 32 F-86 Sabres. They were so outnumbered. He was a wingman, and his lead made a break that he did not anticipate and wound up separated and was hit by two MiGs coming through dives. That heavy punching, he just got heavy punched by 23 and 30 millimeter shells, tore his F-86 up. And he turned and started flying to get the hell out of there and try to live to fight another day. And not only was his engine on fire, but it was coming in internally into the cockpit, and his cockpit filled with smoke. And he put himself back, had to clear and go back on his own oxygen. He couldn't breathe in the cockpit. And when he got out where he thought was over the water, the emergency canopy, they had the CADs on there, the devices to blow the canopy off, failed. And he reached up and he unlocks it, and he's trying to manually open the canopy, and the hood would not come open. So he's now out over, and half of his instruments are out. He's not really sure what his altitude was. All he knows is he's locked in what he thinks is now his coffin, heading for the Yellow Sea. That's when Lieutenant Brewer is fighting off a MiG and roaring around the sky and trying to come back up alongside of him. Meanwhile, inside the cockpit, this lieutenant figures his only way out of the airplane. He reaches into his pocket and he pulls out his .45 and he starts shooting a circle of holes in the canopy overhead. Boom, 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 until there's enough for him to literally knock away, to climb out through, a lion's jaw of shards of broken glass to escape that stricken airplane. And that's what he did. He got out of that airplane and he popped his chute, and the prevailing winds were west to east and took him right back into Indian country. And he landed in North Korea, hit the ground, shed himself of his chute, and he spent the next 2 days slowly working his way westward to try to get back to the water and along the coastline to escape. And 2 days later, he was picked up by the North Koreans, and he was interred, and he spent the remainder of the war and then 2 years after as a POW in North Korea. But he did survive, and he flew and met the pilot who probably saved his life by clearing that MiG-15 as he was exiting the battle in a severely stricken airplane. And so these things, some interesting statistics at the end of this to wrap up this bit of the story about the Korean War and the F-86s. A significant percentage of Sabre pilots who flew combat in 1951 had no previous combat experience. However, U.S. Air Force records state that 11 of the initial 4th Fighter Wing aces had experience in World War II, but some of the new pilots actually fired their Sabres guns for the first time in combat over Korea. At the end of the Korean War, The F-86 Sabres in total flew 87,177 sorties. Out of those, there was 110 Sabres that were lost to enemy aircraft activity. Out of those 110 Sabres that were lost, there was 102 pilots who were missing or killed in action, MIA and KIA, which is a really sobering number when you realize that out of 110 lost aircraft, only 8 pilots, that's less than 8%, were able to get back to the friendly lines, fight another day. The F-86, on the other hand, shot down 782 MiG-15s. And they had 18 other types of aircraft that were destroyed for a nice round number of 800 air-to-air kills from the F-86 Sabre. That is basically 8 to 1, 800 to 110. Quite a ratio for that fighter. And at any given time throughout that war, there was a total of 185 F-86s active in the combat zone between the two groups, the 51st and the 4th. And they were facing continuously throughout the war 800 MiG-15s, 800 to 185. Unbelievable odds. And yet, most of the young fighter pilots who got their start during the Korean War went on to fly much more sophisticated aircraft, such as the North American F-100 Super Sabre, the Republic F-105 Thunder Chief, and the McDonnell F-4 Phantom. When asked what aircraft was their favorite to fly, however, the answer seemed to be unanimous in favor of America's first true air superiority fighter, the old F-86.
We hope you have enjoyed this Infinite Models presentation.